Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to the Cheats Movement podcast on the Family Podcast Network. If you have not already, please take a minute, visit thefamilypn.com and subscribe. We need your support. Joining me today, I'll tell you, I've been on a really, really fortunate. I know I say this every podcast, but I've been on a streak like no other to be able to talk to some amazing people who have done and are doing amazing things and are really at the top of their field at what they do. And this is no different. We're going to have an amazing conversation, mostly centered around the life of Muhammad Ali. But I have the pleasure on the Cheats Movement to introduce you to Jonathan Eig. And he is, I would dare to say, the preeminent Muhammad Ali biographer now. And I'm sure there's so many of them. But his book is so in-depth, so wonderful, and it has won a ton of awards. So with no further ado, John, welcome to the Cheats Movement. We're so honored to have you.
Thanks, Cheats. It's great to be here. I'm excited to talk to you, and always happy to talk about Ali. Like I could go on for days talking about Ali.
Well, let's talk about the book, because the book is just an amazing piece of work. It's like holistic is the best word to say. I mean, it is comprehensive. It is something that I don't think any other author has really taken on the way that you took it on. The book is called A Life, but it's not a section of Ali's life. It's not a section of one particular fight. There have been books I've read. One of the best books I ever read was a book about the fight of the century, just the lead up to one fight Ali Frazier won. But you've taken a different task, and you've taken the whole life of Muhammad Ali. Let me start by asking, what compelled you? What compelled you to take on?
Made me think I could do something so crazy.
What compelled you to take on such a monumental task with someone that everyone that was alive in a certain period of time, a lot of folks still alive, had these direct, important, personal stories of Muhammad Ali. It's an amazing task. How did it come to you to say, I want to be the guy to take this on?
That's a great question. And, like you said, pieces of the story have been done, and they've been done so well. Norman Mailer, David Remnick, George Plimpton, writers that I loved and admired and couldn't touch, had already done those pieces of the story, but nobody had done the big Ali book. Nobody had given him the presidential treatment, the John Meacham, Walter Isaacson kind of book, where you just tell why this man is one of the most important men of all time. The GOAT, obviously, but seriously, one of the most important lives of the 20th century. He deserved the big, fat, serious biography. And like you said, a lot of those people who knew him were still alive. 3 out of his 4 wives were still alive. More than half of the guys he fought were still alive. Ali was still alive when I began working on this. So I thought, first of all, you have to wait a little while. Like, you couldn't have written the definitive Ali biography in the 80s or the 90s. You got to let some time pass to see how he resonates across history, about, what kind of impact he had on the world, on culture, on sports, on race, on religion. But here's somebody who clearly touched all of the most important issues of our time, who changed the world. But now 50 years have gone by since he became champ, and you can start to assess some of that, and you can still talk to the people who knew him. So I felt like this is the sweet spot. It's the perfect time to do a big fat Ali biography, and nobody else was doing it. Why not me?
What did you know about Muhammad Ali's life before you started? Because I know it was hours and hours, years of work and years of interviews, but going into it, what did you know about Ali? Like when you said, I'm going to take this on?
Going in, I'm a fanboy. I had read Remnick, I had read Mailer, I had read Plimpton, and I loved Ali. I was born in '64, so I can remember his fights after the exile. I can remember Ali Frazier and Ali Foreman. I remember those fights as kids, watching them when they were aired. I couldn't watch them live because they were only on closed circuit. My parents wouldn't let me out of the house at midnight to go down to the movie theater to watch it. But I could watch it the next week when it showed up on Wild World of Sports or something. So Ali was a huge figure in my life. Everybody talked about those fights for weeks leading up to them, bigger than any Super Bowl, bigger than any World Series. Wow. And way bigger than the NBA championship back then in the 70s. We're talking about the biggest sports figure in the world, on the planet. And, I was not an expert. I couldn't name more than, maybe 10 or 12 of his fights. I had to learn a lot from scratch. I had to really pretend that I was coming into it cold, as if I, was taking the beginner's class in the beginning. And then I had to become, the world's leading expert on this man's life. And I discovered things about Ali that Ali didn't know about himself.
That is, you make a great point. I believe it was about Ali's grandfather, was it?
Yeah, right.
Something you had said that Ali didn't even know. You just knew he kind of had been in prison, but he didn't know reasons why. And you found out about his lineage. You found out things are unearthed things about, especially about his family and his upbringing, that people didn't know. What are some of the things that you learned during this process that surprised you and obviously surprised those that were close to him?
Well, the one thing you just mentioned, I discovered that Ali's grandfather was convicted of murder, and I got the court transcripts, I got the trial transcripts, and sent him to Ali and to his wife. And Ali was sick at that point, but his wife, told me that she passed it along and explained it to him. And then I discovered that his great-great-great-grandfather had actually been an escaped slave and a hero who had helped the Union by providing information on the movement of Confederate troops. So Ali comes from greatness. He comes from greatness and from has with this dark side of having a grandfather who was convicted of murderer. So when he said he knew he was the greatest, he had that lineage. He had historic bloodlines. There's a statue of his great-great-great-grandfather in Washington, D.C., actually, and Ali didn't know that was his great-great-great-grandfather. So that's just, one little example. There's so many things that, come across 4 years of research. I even counted the number of punches he was hit with in the course of his career. So all the kinds of things from big to the little.
I'm sure he would dispute that.
He would say he was never hit.
Right, it's never hit at all. That's amazing, because every piece of, every book, you mentioned, every documentary, you tend to learn something new. Or you might have heard something, but you put it in a different perspective once you have more kind of knowledge, more understanding, more information base to apply this is what was happening when he did this, or this was what happening when he did this. I could start anywhere. I'm going to ask you, where did you start? So I asked you why you wanted to do it, and what kind of gave you the ability and kind of mental makeup to start. But when you were like, okay, I'm going to do this, who's the first person you talk to? Like, where do you start?
For me, it was pretty obvious. Khalila Ali. His second wife, his first wife had passed away before I began, Sanji Roy. But Khalila Ali, who was Belinda at the time she married him, so 17 years old when she married Ali. I figured, first of all, the women never got to tell their side of the story over the years. All those great books I talked about, the women are barely mentioned, and they're certainly not interviewed. And in part, they weren't interviewed because these were white male sports writers who didn't really think about the Black woman's perspective, and they had access to Ali, and they didn't want to blow that access to Ali by hearing what wives or ex-wives had to say. So one of the things I realized early on is that, Ali had 3 wives who were still with us, one he was still married to, and that they were super important, that their voices deserved to be heard. And they were living witnesses who not only saw what went on in the ring, but saw the man and knew what his idiosyncrasies were, knew what his flaws were. And that if I could gain their trust and convince them that their voices needed to be heard, that their stories needed to be told, that I would do something that no other Ali biographers had ever done. Even the big Thomas Hauser book, which was an oral history of Ali's life that was published in the 90s. His ex-wives were not invited to participate in that.
Is that
book.
right?
No, because that was an authorized book, and Ali was calling the shots, and he didn't want the ex-wives. Sanji was interviewed for that book, I believe, but no, maybe not. No, I don't think she was. I think Lonnie was the only one who was interviewed for that book because she was still married to Ali.
That is amazing. And so starting there, and then moving on, there's so many ways that we can go with an Ali conversation. And so I want to, because there's what happens in the ring, which is such compelling theater, and you capture it so well in regards to actually the fight. Like what's, one of the obviously most strategic boxers, one of the most smartest kind of strategists in regards to actually in the fight, right? One that was younger in his career, all the natural talent in the world, a lot of bad form, a lot of bad technique, to as he's gotten older, he literally has to outthink opponents if he's going to survive, at the time, 15 rounds of just wars, right? But then there's all of this stuff that was a part of Ali's life outside of the ring. And oftentimes the stuff that you see outside the ring, just what's the best way to frame it? Just a lot of contradictions, and is in the overall life that was like captivated by this just amazing, charming, lovable, a magnet of a man that everybody wants to be around. What did you find the most interesting? Because you've written books about sports, and I know you enjoy sports. And obviously there's all of this compelling stuff, compelling drama and comedy and tragedy outside of the ring as well. When you took on this challenge, what did you find the most interesting? The stuff that happened in the ring or outside the ring?
Well, in the ring is in some ways the easiest, because you can watch it and you can see what's going on, and it's so much fun to describe. I look forward to every fight when it comes along, and I have to really restrict myself not to tell you every round and every blow, because it's so much fun to describe the stuff in the ring. But it's the stuff outside the ring that's much harder to deal with, and that's this Ali's one of the most complicated. Everybody's complicated. You and I are complicated, right? If I were to dive into my own life and to tell you, how I feel and how I act and how the gaps between what I'm supposed to do and what I do, we all have our flaws, but Ali was the most complicated guy I've ever written about. He's this seeming narcissist in many ways. It's all about himself, and everything he does, he thinks it's going to turn out fine. He reminded me of Trump in some ways, like, me. And yet, unlike Trump, he really cared about other people, really loved other people, had this great sense of humor. And in some ways, the most egotistical man I've ever come across was also really modest in a way, like never believed he was truly better than anybody else. He would spend time with the lowest of the low, the chambermaid in his hotel who was cleaning the room. He was just as interested in their life as he was in talking to presidents or prime ministers. He was just fascinating in that way.
Talk to me about, because you're exactly right. Talk to me about his career. One of the things that I don't think is talked about enough, actually, is the transitional period between what is the Louisville group and the Nation of Islam. And so there's this interesting group, right, of Ali backers, mostly white males, that fund the early part of his career at the very least. And really, for all case in point, financially, I haven't read otherwise, seem to have done right by him for the most part. But obviously he grows more, understands more of his religion, his spirituality, joins the Nation of Islam. And then once he joins the Nation of Islam, there's the Louisville group, there's Angelo Dundee, there's folks like Bob Arum, right? And so what did you find? Because I've never really, I just know that Ali had this protective thing where it was like, don't mess with Dundee. You know what I mean? Like, certain people are going to do right by me. That's fine. But what was that? What did you learn about that kind of interesting time period where he's coming into the nation? He's announcing after he wins the title that he's in the nation, but he has like all of these kind of other areas that he either has to deal with or ignore, right?
Yeah, this is so interesting. I'm glad you brought this up because this gets back to Ali's complexity, how he's able to like embrace subtlety and conflict. Like he's joining the Nation of Islam, which says that all white people are devils.
Sure.
And yet he's got this Louisville sponsoring group, as you mentioned, all white, all male, not just that, but very conservative leaders of industry. These are people who kind of view him like they view their racehorses at the Kentucky Derby. Like, well, if we own this boxer, we get front row seats to his fights. Yep. And yet they treat Ali very well. He's got a better contract and makes out financially better than any boxer in history. He's getting an annual salary, all of his expenses paid, plus a trust fund being established to make sure he'll have something when he retires from boxing. And these guys are really not interested in making a lot of money themselves. They're doing this because it's like an issue of civic pride. And even after Ali joins the Nation of Islam, and even after he begins following Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X and saying that white society is going to be destroyed and a spaceship is going to come down and destroy all white people, only black people will survive. And even after he fires the Louisville sponsoring group, he still comes back for these kids' birthday parties. Like when he finds out one of these guys from the Louisville sponsoring group has had a heart attack, he drops everything and rushes to the hospital, flies across the country. So that's what I'm talking about. This guy loves people, and he's got on one hand this really radical philosophy about how he views race. And yet that does not stop him from being able to care about and appreciate these very conservative white businessmen in Louisville. It's just, I love that complexity. I love that somebody can embrace both worlds and both sets of ideas.
It's so strange. And tell me about the Dundee relationship, the Angelo Dundee relationship, because it seems as if when the Nation of Islam was able kind of to influence his business. Herbert Muhammad's his manager. There's there were parts that obviously you know about this, where it's like he wasn't even taking the drinking water because he was like, somebody could be doing something to me. Yet no one could mess with Angelo Dundee, right? And Angelo, for all case and points, from what I understand, was not a fan of the Nation being around, wasn't a fan of Malcolm X being around. He just thought it was too much of a distraction. If anything, could be more. You will definitely know more, but it could have been more. I don't know much about his personal, background and kind of his, Angelo Dundee's thoughts, but I knew he kind of viewed this as something that wasn't good to be around Ali, right? But yet Angelo Dundee was untouchable, right, in Ali's eyes.
Absolutely, because he was the trainer who really understood Ali. He was, and Ali, never forgot that this guy believed in him all along. And they had this very deep psychological, really amazing working relationship where Dundee appreciated that Ali was not somebody you could tell what to do. And you had to just give him suggestions for what to do. And, Ali would go into the ring and Dundee would have no idea what the strategy for the fight was. He didn't have to know. And he gave Ali the room that he needed to be himself. If you tried to train Ali in too specific a way, you might lose the magic because he was an idiosyncratic fighter. He did not fight with proper style, with proper technique. The whole idea later in his career, when he starts trying this rope-a-dope thing, I mean, no boxing trainer would ever encourage a fighter to let himself be hit. It was a terrible strategy. It only worked for Ali, and it only worked a couple of times, but it worked because Ali believed in it, and Dundee really had no say in the matter. And it's worth remembering that Ali had a bunch of people in his entourage. Most of them were not Muslims. Most of them were people who thought the Nation of Islam was crazy. Pacheco, even Bundini. Bundini Brown was harsh when it came to criticizing the Nation of Islam. So Ali was able to recognize that these people loved him and cared about him, and they didn't have to agree on religion for him to work with and to live with. I mean, these were practically family for him.
And that relationship really was one that, like, it could be its own. I think it is its own movie and it's its own book in regards to Muhammad Ali, then at the time Malcolm X, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and that just dynamic, right? really, really, I don't think it can be overstated how tense that time period was. The time period, especially after he wins the title, it always blows my mind. Ali wins the title in February 64, and it's March of 65, where then Malcolm X was assassinated, right? Very, very tense time period, obviously in the country, but obviously within the Nation of Islam. And these two very, very powerful folks, obviously, one being much more powerful than the other inside the nation, are almost kind of, they both obviously have great love and reference for Ali, but they're also kind of using his position as almost like a pawn's not the right word. You probably, John, have a better word than I do, but they're both trying to use Ali as leverage, right? How did he go? How did Ali go about navigating what seems to be at the time? I think most people would say kind of Malcolm's last play to get back in the good graces of Muhammad Ali. I mean, of Elijah Muhammad.
Yeah, this is so perilous and tense, as you said. And there's a good book about it, Blood Brothers, about the Ali Malcolm relationship. But it's a struggle for survival and a struggle for the soul of the Nation of Islam, and really a struggle for what's to become of the Muslim world in America, because this is all being shaped at the time, and Malcolm is challenging Elijah Muhammad for control, for leadership, and Elijah's sees Ali as a pawn. It may be the right word for it, that whoever gets Ali is going to have a huge advantage in terms of attracting the public to their side. And that's why Elijah Muhammad offers him this name. Ali it looks like he might be going with Malcolm.
Right. The name thing is something that I think a lot of casual layman Ali fans really overlook about the timing of the name and what it meant. And it was almost, right, correct me if I'm wrong, it was kind of the final thing where Malcolm understood, like, yeah, this isn't going to work. Like, this isn't.
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of like a marriage proposal. Looks like Ali might be marrying Malcolm, right? And he actually announces that he's going to change his name to Cassius X. And then he gets a call from Elijah Muhammad saying, guess what? I've decided that you're going to marry me. I'm giving you a special name and a true honor that only the highest people in the Nation of Islam receive. You're going to receive a first name and a last name. You will not be Cassius X. You will be Muhammad Ali, and you will be my son. And Ali can't say no, to an offer like that. And when Malcolm hears on the radio that Cassius Clay has accepted this new name, and he'll be now known as Muhammad Ali, Malcolm knows it's over. He knows he's been outflanked.
Your book does this well, but there is a person of all the people in Muhammad Ali's orbit there, and you mentioned in this interview that I really didn't think about until you put it in perspective about his wives not having their voices really kind of seeked out and told. Someone that is, I think, is ubiquitous in all of these stories, but you never hear from as much as his brother. Muhammad Ali's brother is with him the pictures, the things that you're like, oh, there's Malcolm X, or there's Howard Bingham, there's Bundini. His brother, he called him Rudy, and then he joined the nation, changed his name as well, is always there through his entire life. And I've never really, been able, is there a reason we don't hear from his brother, who's literally was with him every step of the way, right?
Yeah, it's crazy. I joked about it because I helped make the Ken Burns documentary on Ali. And I said, let's count how many times Rahman appears in this documentary. He's in every picture. He's standing next to or behind Ali in every photo. He travels with him everywhere. He's a bigger part of Ali's life than some of his wives. And yet you never hear from him.
Was there a reason behind that? Because I've noticed that. And I was just like,
in part, it's because he's so loyal to Ali that he would never talk out of school.
Okay.
He would never say anything that would hurt Ali or would stir up controversy. He was a really humble guy. And I think people just kind of overlooked him all those years. Nobody ever wrote a story about him. Nobody ever interviewed him back in the day. I spent some time with him. I visited him 3 or 4 times in Louisville. He's still alive.
Yeah.
We got him on film for the Ken Burns documentary. And he's a sweet man. But totally overlooked over the course of history.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Cheats Movement podcast. It's on the Family Podcast Network. Make sure you visit thefamilypn.com and subscribe. We are talking to a Muhammad Ali expert. That's the only way you can call it now, the Muhammad Ali expert. Jon, you've done years. You said, 4 years of research? Well over,
Yep.
You stopped counting, but well over 600 interviews.
Right.
Who are some of the, I'm sure there's aha moments in just about every interview, but of the people you talk to that you were like, man, this is amazing stuff. Like, this is just like paradigm shifting stuff that are still that you got in person with for this book. Who are some of the folks that you spoke to that really just, the book would not have, obviously you mentioned the wives, but the book would not have been the same without these conversations? Oh
man, yeah, there's so many. The wives, for sure. The children. Gene Kilroy, who was Ali's business manager and was there for every step of the way, and he helped me tremendously. Helped me get me in touch with other people who got to talk to George Foreman, Larry Holmes. But probably my favorite interview was Don King.
And I've heard that this was not an easy interview to get. You had to track. I saw in your other interviews you had to track Don King all across the country, which to me seems odd because it seems like Don King hasn't seen a microphone he doesn't like, right?
I know. I was so surprised, but I kept calling him up. I had his cell phone, and I'd call him up, and he'd say, "Sorry, brother, I'm busy. I'm working on the Middle East peace right now," or he always had something big going on, and I wasn't important enough for him. So I tracked him down a couple of times and just went where he was, and he still wouldn't talk to me. And really? Some people wanted money for interviews, and I wouldn't pay, and that was an impediment. It took me a while to get over that. Don never asked for money, which was kind of surprising given his business he's in, but he just didn't have the time of day for me. Then finally, I tracked him down to Easton, Pennsylvania. He was there for a Larry Holmes statue dedication. I followed him around for 2-3 days.
Wait a second. What?
Yeah, Larry Holmes has a statue.
I know. Saying at some point, I'm surprised like Larry Holmes even talks to Don King at this point. I
guess
right. They made up.
How is that possible? Right. How does anybody who fought for Don King still speak to him? Right.
Oh, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, Jon.
So I finally get him in the corner, and he finally says, "Okay, fine, I'll sit and talk to you." And then I started thinking, because I've been around him, I've heard him interviewed a million times. He always does the same shtick, right? Only in America, blah, blah, blah. Like, how are you going to get this guy to say something different? How are you going to get him to answer honestly? And I spent all day thinking about what's my first question going to be? Because if it's a bad question, he's just going to go into his routine. And that routine everybody's heard. So I sat down next to him, and I stuck my tape recorder under his chin. And I said, "Don, Nation of Islam, Mafia, hundreds of boxers you ripped off over the years. How come you're still alive?" And he loved that question.
He liked it. He
loved it.
That was the one that got him. Oh wow.
He loved it.
What did he say?
He said, "Cash is king, baby, and king is cash." But he said the reason I'm still alive is that before I began, when I had Ali on the hooks, I went to Elijah Muhammad, and I said, "You're letting white people make all this money off of Muhammad Ali. You need to let a brother get a piece of this action. And I'm going to take care of him in a way that no white promoter ever will or ever could." And I'd even consider joining the Nation of Islam because I believe in much of what you're saying about empowering Black people, if it wasn't for the thing about pork.
Oh, geez.
And he said, "Listen, if I can give you some advice, Elijah Muhammad, just get rid of that pork ban, and your membership will go through the roof."
I'm sure
get a lot more.
This is amazing. Man, that's it.
And he talked to me like after that. He said to me, "You're okay. You know what?" And I could tell. I learned the thing I figured out about Don from that time together is that he actually likes to talk, and he's a good listener. You just got to get him out of his routine. And I called him the next day and said, I just wanted to thank you for the conversation. And he said, well, I enjoyed it. Why don't you come to my house? We're having a Christmas party later in the week. And he invited me to his family Christmas party, which I went to. It took my little girls to, which was like one of the most incredible experiences of my life.
How much of the kind of Don King's his own entity, but how much of like the animosity between Aram and King, how much of it, I know it was real, but how real was, because these are two guys, just to be frank, at the time, these are two guys you don't mess with. You don't mess with Don King. Obviously, you don't mess with Bob Arum. You don't mess with the Nation of Islam, right? The FBI is probably tracking all of this. Or not probably, it's documented now. The FBI is tracking all of this. What was the dynamic between Bob Arum, Don King, the Nation, and Ali himself?
Yeah, it's amazing that all these people managed somehow to get anything done together. Because Arum and King still don't like each other, as you can imagine.
Ranking, yeah, they're not getting along.
And they both didn't like Herbert Muhammad, who was managing Ali. That's one of the things I loved about this book. You've got all of these massive egos, and Ali is such a big star. He's the sun around which even these massive egos can revolve, right? His gravitational pull is so strong that they're all willing to behave, or at least like somehow not kill each other, because they all see Ali and they all want to, of course, they all want to make money off of Ali. That's a big part of it too.
And it's funny because you say all of this, and what we all know, especially at that time, probably still to this day, is a pretty corrupt industry, right? Like, this is an industry that was mafia ran, mob ran before this, and it's really interesting. I know we've got so much to talk about, and I want to jump to one. You had mentioned while you were doing the book, obviously, I think Howard Bryant, the sports writer, who's done a lot of biographies and is doing another great one now, said in an interview sometime where it's like, if there doesn't come a point where you don't hate your subject, you're probably not doing it right. You'd mentioned there was a part of the riff, I guess that kind of the final straws between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X that really made you personally, it was like, I wish it hadn't gone that direction. When I always look back at the life and the career of Muhammad Ali, I look back to the Joe Frazier fights, and I look at an Ali that really, like, Joe Frazier probably to his death grave couldn't get over it to an extent. He says he got over it, and so, but there's probably parts of Joe Frazier that still hold a lot of contempt for Muhammad Ali, even when he passed. And I look at it, I was like, I can't blame him. It just seems so out of character. Not necessarily. It just seemed more personal and actually more mean through the three Frazier fights of what they did. And was, do you look back at the, mostly, I guess, the lead up to promote those fights, but because it always seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, where it was like Ali would go above and beyond to promote the fight and probably go just way too far. And he did cut personal and cut deep. But Frazier just wasn't that type of guy. And so did you ever look back at those lead ups to those fights and was just like, this one's tough? Like, that seems to be the worst.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what Howard Bryant said is absolutely true, that if you're getting deep into somebody's life, you're going to have moments where you just feel like they really let you down. And there were really three areas in which Ali let me down. And one was his treatment of women. The other was his turning his back on Malcolm when I believe he could have saved Malcolm's life. And then the way he treated his friend, Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier truly was a friend. Ali had a lot of fans, he had a lot of supporters, he had a lot of people in his entourage who loved him, but just friends, like equals, friends that you weren't the boss of. Joe Frazier was one of them. Frazier really cared about Ali. When Ali was banned from boxing, Frazier looked after him and took care of him and visited him, hung out with him. And Ali forgot all about that when it came to time to fight him. And part of Ali's the entertainer. He thinks this is funny, this is how you sell tickets. But he was not a stupid man. He had to realize that he was hurting this guy. And, again, like the narcissism comes into play here. Maybe that just doesn't register in his brain. Like he doesn't think that anyone's going to take this personally, and he can't really feel what Frasier's feeling. But it gets so personal, it gets so racist, and he's using some of the worst racist tropes that white segregationists, the most racist white men in America, would use to hurt Black people. He's using the same words, and he doesn't seem to be aware of the effect of that, or even just the effect that it has on other Black people hearing these words, or that it might even authorize white people to feel like they can use those words too, right? Or what it means for Joe Frazier's kids. He's not thinking about any of this, and nobody in his entourage has the guts to say to him, stop. And that's infuriating to me.
Did he, now he's obviously much later in life said the Malcolm, that part of his life, he kind of regretted. Did he ever show any kind of regret or remorse to the Frazier stuff?
Not really. Like, there are different levels of apology. I think, to apologize is one thing, to atone for your sins is another. And he never atoned. He never tried to make it right. He might have a couple of times said, oh, well, me and Joe, we were pals. We were just fooling around, and I didn't mean to hurt his feelings. But that's not the same as a genuine apology in my book.
As far as a fighter, there's obviously the Frazier fights, the Sonny Liston fights, even the George Foreman fights. What gets lost to me is the Ken Norton fights.
Yeah.
The Ken Norton fights were wars. And there's a mini doc about the Yankee Stadium Ken Norton fight, where it was like the police were on strike, and it really was just it was a dangerous scene out there. And Ali wins the decision, very controversial decision. And there's a part of the doc that says, "Hey, look, I don't know what was the background of those judges, but I do know if Ali had lost the fight, and there would have been just riots to the point, and no cops, right? Because the cops were on strike." Obviously, he's had so many legendary fights that we mentioned in legendary, just golden era of boxing and 15 rounds. But do you think, because towards the end of the career is when those fights really started taking some toll on him, the Norton fights seem to be some of the most brutal? Is that right? Or
yeah, I think they were. Ali, first of all, wasn't training as hard at that stage in his career. He'd lost some of the discipline. I think some of the blows to the head over the years took their toll on his desire and his ability to really train hard for these fights. And plus, the richer and more famous you get, the harder it is to really push yourself in the training. And then Norton just matched up stylistically really badly for Ali. Fighting is not always about who's the better fighter. It's about whose style gives you the most trouble. And Frazier, Frazier got destroyed by George Foreman, but Frazier's style gave Ali fits, and Norton's style also gave Ali fits. And I think that's why, he really surprised him in that first fight. I think Ali won the second fight, and I think he lost the third fight. I think the New York fight, I think Norton probably really deserved the decision on that one. But those fights took a real toll, obviously, not just a broken jaw. But by that point in his career, Ali's fighting terrific fighters. He's fighting long fights. Even mediocre opponents are taking him sometimes the distance, and he's suffering a lot of damage to just head trauma as a result of all these fights. And you can start to see it. You can start to see how his speech is slowing, and he's starting to have memory issues, and even some physical signs that something's wrong. Some twitching in the hands, and that's when you really start to wish that he would just call it quits. Every fight, you feel like, okay, let's make that the last one. And that was really hard for me.
And it mostly after every fight, didn't he say, well, this is it for me?
This is it.
And then they would,
and somebody would say, well, how about $1 million to fight Trevor Burbick? Okay, sure.
Let's move forward to the and John, I really, really love your time, and I really am appreciative of it. And I'm having a lot of fun as well. And let's talk about kind of now as we see the legacy of Muhammad Ali. And it is, all over culture, all over American culture. Everybody kind of knows him now as the GOAT. You can't really say even the word greatest of all time without saying Muhammad Ali. But there is a real shift, right? And real love and real respect for all that Ali has done. Not, like you said, not just in the ring, but the courage to be the heavyweight champion of the world and say he's a member of the Nation of Islam. And I'm going to be, I'm going to be a champion the way I want to be the champion. Obviously, his anti-war stance in Vietnam, looking back on it, hindsight's 2020. He was right. There was in his courage at the time. So we look back on this life and legacy and things that are still going, and everybody seems to, from President of the United States would say Muhammad Ali is just great human being, great humanitarian. And that wasn't always the case, obviously, as we're living through it. I think you mentioned possibly 1996 in the Atlanta Olympic Games as a real turning point. But are you in many ways surprised about how American culture and the world and global culture views Muhammad Ali today after going through his entire life and career? Is it surprising to you that, it's Muhammad Ali and Nelson Mandela and Barack Obama, and these are all like, is it surprising at all?
It's not really surprising to me. The evolution of it has been interesting. And in some ways, I think it's actually getting better. For a while, I was really concerned about it. And Stanley Crouch, the great writer, said that Ali, there were three Alis. When Ali was young, he was a grizzly bear. He was ferocious. He was out of control. He was dangerous. And then Ali in like the 70s becomes more like a circus bear. He's still dangerous, but he's there to entertain us mostly. And then the last act after the Olympic torch in the 90s, he becomes a teddy bear. And we all just want to hug him. And that troubled me because, if you treat Ali as a saint, as the Dalai Lama, he becomes meaningless in a way. You forget that he was a fighter, that he was fighting for racial justice, that he was fighting against war, and that he was hated by the majority of white Americans for most of his active career. And we need to remember that. But I do think now that he's become this icon of the movement, Black Lives Matter, these athletes taking a stand and refusing to play after George Floyd. You see LeBron, you see the Milwaukee Bucks refusing to take to the court. You see, people like Colin Kaepernick invoking his image. And Ali has become in many ways much more than a teddy bear now. He's a reminder that shut up and dribble is not something we have to accept. That's what they told him. Shut up and fight. Be grateful for what white society has given you, this chance to be a millionaire. No, that doesn't mean we're going to keep our mouths shut. And I think Ali in some ways is getting his voice back, and he's not just a teddy bear anymore.
That's an interesting, I think you're exactly right. I think it's an interesting perspective. I do wonder when you're doing your interviews, because like you say, even with the approach of Don King, it's like, I've got to get some honesty and some truth out of it. Because I'm assuming when you start your project at the time that you started it a couple of years ago, it was still in a looking back and saying, everybody's going to want to say great things about Ali, especially early on. The George Foreman conversations, or like you said, some of the folks that really had some real hard resentment. Was it did you have to massage the conversation to get how they were truly feeling, or did they? Because I'm assuming most people that come into the conversation with you, especially initially, wanting just to say positive, glowing things.
Yeah, and that's the fun part for me is getting people to get past like their boilerplate stuff, and these fighters, you got to realize that they're fighters. They never stop feeling that sense of competition. And every one of them, if you spend enough time with them, George Foreman, he'll say, "Oh, Ali was the greatest. I learned so much from him. He taught the world about love and peace." But damn it, I beat him. I was cheated out of that fight. And Larry Holmes will say that he's a stupid mother. You don't let yourself get hit like that. After a while, these guys loosen up. And Larry Holmes will say, "I loved Ali. He was like a father to me. He's like a big brother to me. But man, what a stupid fool to take all those punches. And I hated to have to fight him. I hated to have to do that damage to him. But he deserved it because he should have known when to quit."
I could only imagine. John, let me ask you about not necessarily the life of Ali, but actually what the aftermath of you publishing something of this magnitude, scope, nature. We briefly talked about all the accolades, and they're all well deserved. It's an amazing book, and well deserved on all the accolades that you got. You mentioned Don King's birthday, Don King's birth. What's some of the coolest things that have happened after you published the book? And because I'm assuming there's obviously accomplished author. You've done some really, really good, like, award-winning stuff, but now you've dropped the definitive Muhammad Ali book. Does the world change for you in a sense, in regards to just even doing something as interesting as maybe going to a fight or going to the Boxing Hall of Fame? And it's like, is it different for you now?
Not really. I go back to work and start on the next project. But, I have to say, it's an amazing honor just to see my name linked to Muhammad Ali's. Sure. We were together in a Jeopardy question. Like, my name appeared in a Jeopardy question. That was not because of me. Like, I'm not famous, but it's because I wrote a book about Muhammad Ali. So that's cool. Like, the fact that somehow for many, many years, long after I'm gone, I'll be linked to him is just one of the great thrills and, like, accomplishments. I could never have dreamed of that as a kid, that I would someday be in that position. So, it's interesting because not everybody liked the book. For family members, some of it was hard to read. Mm. And I knew that going in, that these, especially the women who trusted me to tell the story, it was going to be hard for them to read, because it's painful to read about his the way he cheated on the wives. And it's painful to read about, the blows to the head and the effects it took over the years and the bad decisions he made. And I have a responsibility to tell the whole story and not sugarcoat it. And sometimes that leads people who I got to know and trust and love really well, who were part of my life, didn't always love the book. And that's hard for me. But I like to think that, I'm helping people to understand the real Ali, and that that's, it's worth whatever comes my way.
Jon, I'm going to ask you, before we get you out of here, I'm going to ask you about going backwards before Ali, and then I'm going to ask you going forward, because I know you're working on some very interesting, compelling stuff now that hasn't been released yet. But going backwards, I would be remiss if I don't ask you about Jackie Robinson. I'm a huge baseball fan, huge Negro League fan in that sense. I know Robinson, Kansas City Monarchs, before they make him the individual to break the Major League Baseball color barrier. Your book chronicles the first year of Jackie Robinson's Major League Baseball career. Is that right?
Yeah.
Talk to me about just Jackie Robinson, that process of writing that book, and if possible, was this process different or very similar to writing about Ali's?
The Jackie book was really interesting for me because it relied so heavily on one person to tell that story, and that was Mrs. Robinson, Rachel Robinson. And it began with a conversation I had with her where I wanted to know more about the relationship between her husband and Pee Wee Reese. So much had been written about their friendship and about this moment in 1947 when Pee Wee supposedly put his arm around Jackie Robinson and silenced this crowd of racist hecklers.
Did that happen? It's in the movie.
And right, it's in the movie. There's a statue. It's in every children's book. And Rachel Robinson says, well, it didn't happen. And I said, what are you talking about? It didn't happen.
No.
I said, you were at the statue dedication. And she said, yeah, well, sometimes you just got to go along with things.
Oh.
And she said, and this is what gave me the idea for the book. She said, in 1947, Pee Wee was not going to go out on a limb for us because everybody believed that this experiment was going to fail. We didn't even have our own apartment. We were renting a room from a complete stranger because we thought we might be there for a week or two. We did not know if this was going to work. And that's when I realized that the story was an experiment, that you've got this young couple with a baby renting an 8x10 room. They don't have their own bathroom. They don't have their own kitchen. And at any moment, this thing could crash and burn.
Sure.
And I wanted to know what it was like to be in that room, that 8x10 room. And that was where my vision for this book began. Like, if I could show you in one season how not just baseball, but the whole world changes, and you can see it through the eyes of this journey of this young married couple from LA arriving in Brooklyn, and Jackie being the only Negro, as they called it then, in a league of 400 white men, what that was like for him and what was like for his family, then I'd have a hell of a story.
That's amazing. Well, after, so we were joking about this off the air, but Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, you're not taking light topics here. And you just told me you just turned in a book, and this was it'll be published sometime next year, and it's on the life of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, just a real easy one. I'm taking all the easiest
John,
subjects.
what are you doing to yourself, John? What are you doing to yourself?
This was 5 years, this book. And, what happened was I'm researching the meetings between Ali and King. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know, how many times they met, where and when. And I realized that the last biography of Martin Luther King, to me, the greatest American ever born, the last biography was 35 years ago. That's 5 years ago. Now it's 40 years since the last Martin Luther King biography was published. And like I said about Ali, there's still people alive who knew him, and the clock is ticking. How much more time am I going to have to interview these folks? This could be the last opportunity to write a King biography where you can interview his sister, where you can interview Andrew Young, you can interview his childhood friends, you can interview Jesse Jackson, James Lawson, Bernard Lafayette. So I just started making the rounds. I don't know if they're going to let me write this book. I don't know if I'm going to get a contract for it. I just started making the rounds, interviewing as many of those people as I could, as quick as I could, and I found more than 100 people who knew King, and I interviewed, more than 100 people who knew King. And it's been like the most unbelievable privilege of my life to spend some time and record their stories.
That's amazing. Well, Jon, this has been a privilege of mine. Thank you so much for your time. Tell everybody, because don't get it twisted. You're pretty quick on Twitter as well and social medias. Tell everybody where they can find you, Jon.
All right, Cheats. Thanks. Just check me out at Jonathan Eig on Twitter, and jonathaneig.com is my website. Buy some books, spread the love around, help me out, and I'll be sure and tell folks about this podcast because I really enjoyed talking to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Cheats Movement on the Family Podcast Network. We'll be right back after this.